"Do you people eat human bodies?" I said one day upon entering a native village, and pointed to a quantity of meat spitted upon long skewers being smoke-dried over numerous smoldering fires. "Yes, don't you?" was the instant reply. And a few minutes later, the chieftain of the village came forward with an offering, which consisted of large and generous portions of flesh, only too obviously of human origin. He seemed genuinely disappointed when I refused. Historically shrouded in mystery, myth, symbolism, fear, and speculation, cannibalism remains in most cultures one of the ultimate taboos. According to William Aaron's book, The Man-Eating Myth, the first known account of cannibalism came following an expedition to the West Indies led by Christopher Columbus. Columbus and his crew supposedly discovered that the Carib West Indies tribe participated in a particularly gruesome practice of ritually eating the flesh of other humans. The explorers mispronounced the name of the tribe and referred to them as cannibs, which was over time changed to cannibales, meaning thirsty and cruel in Spanish. The English translation of the Spanish word became cannibalism, which is the most widely used term to express humans' consumption of other human beings. The Latin form of the word cannibalism is anthropophagy, and is a term used mostly in anthropology and archaeology. The existence of cannibalism has been a widely disputed topic in academia. However, the evidence supporting its existence is abundant and is represented in every medium imaginable, including stories, symbols, legends, writings, archaeological evidence, and first-hand accounts. Cannibalism is a practice that reaches across centuries and cultures. In many cultures, it is considered atrocious and sacrilegious, whereas in another culture, it is a sacred and revered custom. Cannibalism is an undeniable occurrence rooted in antiquity and branching forth to the present day. The exact origin of cannibalism is a mystery and will most likely remain so. Some anthropologists believe that cannibalism began in the earliest human history and proliferated with man's increasing attempts to appease the gods, survive famine, or exact revenge on or control his enemies. To date, archaeological evidence suggests that cannibalism was practiced as far back as the Neolithic period and Bronze Age in what is now Europe and the Americas. According to Tim White in Once Were Cannibals, evidence found in Croatia points to cannibalism amongst Neanderthal tribes. The bones of Neanderthals were discovered during an archaeological excavation, which suggests that humans ate the brains of other humans. Panche Hadziandanov wrote in Cannibalism in Archaeology that some of the criteria archaeologists use to identify cannibalism from human remains include evidence of brain exposure, facial mutilation, burnt bone, dismemberment, cut marks, bone breakage, hammerstone abrasions, and missing vertebrae. Although not all of the criteria were met when studying the bones found in Croatia, the most crucial key elements were present, including crushing of the heads and bones, burning of the bodies, suggesting they had been roasted over a fire, and evidence of hammering to split the brain open. A wealth of archaeological and anthropological evidence discovered in Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the Far East, and Middle East further suggests the far-reaching capabilities of cannibalistic practices. The motivations behind the practice of cannibalism vary cross-culturally and per situation and cannot be easily categorized. However, there are several forms of cannibalism that appear to be more prevalent in certain areas of the world and in certain situations. There are many forms of spiritual and ritualistic cannibalism worldwide. Exocannibalism is defined as a culture, group, or tribe's consumption of another culture, group, or tribe. This form of cannibalism has been associated with tribal power, murder, and aggression, and has been used to scare off possible invading enemies, or to get rid of captured enemies of war and slaves. Many cannibalistic tribes believe that consuming one's enemy would allow them to obtain and absorb the spirit and skills of the victim. Conversely, the consumption of members within one's own culture, group, or tribe is called endocannibalism, which is often associated with ritual burial ceremonies and has been controversially referred to on occasion as compassionate cannibalism. Mortuary cannibalism has been considered to be the most widely practiced form of endocannibalism, often excluding murder and focusing on already deceased corpses. For example, According to anthropologist Beth Conklin in an article by Ellie Schick, mortuary cannibalism amongst the Wari tribe of the Amazon rainforest had a socially integrative dimension. Upon consumption of the deceased group member, the spirit of the dead was believed to be absorbed by the entire tribe and was considered by them to be one of the most respectful ways to treat a human body. Throughout the world, anthropologists have discovered that cannibalistic tribes incorporate many different forms of cannibalism. It is not uncommon for one particular group, culture, or tribe to practice a mixture of ritualistic endo and exo-cannibalism, as well as other forms such as survival and Epicurean nutritional cannibalism, consumption of human flesh for the taste or nutritional value. The ancient Aztecs in Mexico were believed to have sacrificed and cannibalized thousands of humans on an annual basis. The Aztecs were believed to have practiced exo-cannibalism, as well as endo-cannibalism and survival cannibalism. Human sacrifice and cannibalism were practiced in an effort to create a universal balance between the world and the cosmos. Aztecs believed that sacrificing humans, either from their own culture or from an outside culture, would appease the gods, and if they failed to do so, it would mark the destruction of all humanity. According to Peggy Sanday in her book Divine Hunger, cannibalism was a holy act, which allowed men to obtain divine powers through communication with their gods. Cannibalism was also practiced during times of great famine. Other cultures participated in endo and exo-cannibalism for similar reasons, such as the North American Indians, known as the Iroquoian. They believed that sacrificing and consuming the bodies of their enemies would satisfy their war god and lead to their spirit being transferred and absorbed into their own bodies. The absorbed spirit was believed to empower the cannibal with the attributes of the dead person. Moira Martingale, author of Cannibal Killers, claims that this form of ritualistic cannibalism was practiced by the Iroquoian culture as recently as 1838. There have also been reports of tribes in Papua New Guinea known to have practiced endo and exo-cannibalism up until the 1960s for ritualistic purposes. Some of the tribes partook of cannibalism for purposes other than ritual reasons, such as for the taste. However, a majority of the tribes were known to mostly consume their dead relatives' tissues and brains in a ceremonial and traditional display of respect. The practice did have deadly repercussions. It was discovered that many of the tribespeople were suffering from a fatal disease believed by scientists to be related to their cannibalistic activities. According to anthropologist Margaret Mackenzie, a scientific team led by Carlton Gajdusek and Baruch Blumberg discovered that women were passing on a disease to their children, believed to be the human equivalent of mad cow disease in the late 1970s. The disease, which became more widespread over a short period of time, was due to an infectious agent introduced by the consumption of deceased human tissues, especially that of the brain. The disease, referred to as kuru, was highly infectious and was transferred in a variety of methods, including through bodily fluids. The spread of this disease only began to diminish when the practice of cannibalism decreased. Ritualistic cannibalism is frowned upon by most cultures. However, it plays an integral part in those cultures that do practice it. In many ways, the act has been a traditional custom representing their values and belief system for hundreds and perhaps thousands of years. However, with the fear of disease, which has the possibility of extinguishing cultures permanently, tribes are forced to find a way around their practices and possibly incorporate a more symbolic and less literal form of ritual. It is not disease alone that has caused a reduction in many forms of ritualistic and spiritual cannibalism. The spread of Christianity by missionary agencies has also led to a significant decrease in the practice. A National Geographic article, Island of the Pacific, for a Man-Size Appetite, stated that by the close of the 19th century, Christian influences ended cannibalistic practices on the island of Fiji. In fact, the spread of Christianity is believed to have significantly diminished cannibalism worldwide. Perhaps the only generally accepted form of cannibalism is when humans eat the flesh of other humans in an attempt to stay alive in adverse and desperate situations. Survival cannibalism is rare and explicable in many cases, yet is still an act that is often punishable by law. There have been several prominent cases of survival cannibalism over the last 200 years, including that of the Donner Party expedition, and the more recent cases that occurred in the Andes Mountains following a plane crash. In 1846, a group of 89 men, women, and children led by a man named George Donner set out across the Sierra Nevada mountains en route to California. During the trek, the weather took an unexpected turn, and they were forced to take an alternative route. The travelers began to run out of food and other resources. Many died from exposure and starvation. Half of the travelers perished before the remaining people eventually succumbed to their situation and began to feed on the flesh of the dead in an attempt to survive. The 46 survivors were eventually rescued. However, upon reaching civilization, they were regarded as monstrous criminals and tried for their actions. The travelers served for around 6 months before they were re-released back into their communities. In 1972, a group of rugby players, their friends and families, left on an airplane for Chile from Uruguay. The plane crashed into the snow-covered Andes Mountains, killing 13 of the 45 passengers on board the aircraft. Many of the passengers died over the weeks from crash-related injuries. Without any provisions, those left alive resorted to cannibalizing the dead. Those who refused to eat the human flesh died of starvation. After 70 days in the mountains, 16 survivors were rescued and taken home. Even in the most extreme cases, the act of cannibalism is treated with scorn and disgust by many cultures and is sometimes punishable by social ostracization, institutionalization in a mental facility, arrest, incarceration, or even death. Cannibalism is most commonly believed to be the epitome of savage behavior. Although disease and religion have greatly diminished the practice, it continues to be practiced worldwide. Disorganized cannibalistic practices amongst criminals have been steadily increasing over the last century, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Lawmakers around the world have been forced to update laws pertaining to cannibalism or establish new laws where none existed before. Criminal cannibalism has become the concern of the future. In modern times, the murder of a person or the use of a corpse for the purpose of consumption by another human in any situation, outside that of conditions of starvation, is considered to be a form of criminal cannibalism or anthropophagy. However, the definition of and laws governing criminal cannibalism vary considerably from culture to culture. In many parts of the world, cannibalism is not considered a crime in and of itself, and it is often only recognized in concurrence with another crime. For example, in Britain and the United States of America, cannibalism is not considered to be a felony but is socially unacceptable. Those who have been found to participate in the gruesome act are usually charged with another crime that is directly related to the act of cannibalism, such as murder, grave robbery, or necrophilia. In other cultures, what some deem to be an act of criminal cannibalism may be an acceptable element of another culture. For example, Japanese enemies were allegedly consumed during the height of World War II by tribes in Papua New Guinea, which was acceptable in the culture during that period. There are many who refuse to believe that cannibalism is practiced in this modern, civilized age. However, there is much evidence suggesting that it does occur and with some frequency. There have been many documented cases of cannibalism, especially within the last 100 years. There are 4 primary forms of criminal cannibalism: sexual cannibalism, aggression cannibalism, spiritual and ritual cannibalism, Epicurean, nutritional cannibalism. These various forms substantially overlap with one another. For example, one may consume human flesh for several purposes, such as to achieve a sense of power and control, aggression cannibalism. Yet one may also find the taste to be agreeable, Epicurean, nutritional cannibalism. Another may indulge in cannibalism in order to reach a higher spiritual affinity with the person they have devoured, simultaneously achieving intense sexual gratification. Sexual cannibalism is considered to be a psychosexual disorder, which involves a person sexualizing the consumption of another person's flesh. This does not necessarily suggest that the cannibal achieves sexual gratification only in the act of consuming human flesh, but also may release sexual frustration or pent-up anger. Sexual cannibalism is considered to be a form of sexual sadism and is often associated with the act of necrophilia, sex with corpses. There have been several high-profile cases that have involved sexual cannibalism, including that of André Chikatilo, Edward Gein, Albert Fish, Armin Meiwes, and Jeffrey Dahmer. During the 1920s, Americans were confronted with the horrors of Albert Fish. who was said to have raped, murdered, and eaten a number of children. Fish was a sexual cannibal in the truest sense of the term, and claimed to have experienced enormous sexual pleasure when he imagined eating a person or when he actually indulged his fantasies. Andrei Chikatilo, a Russian serial killer, was responsible for the murders of scores of young boys and girls. During most of his life, Chikatilo suffered from impotence and was only able to achieve sexual gratification from the torture and murder of other people. He would often mutilate and then consume the flesh of his victims, including the breasts, genitalia, and internal sex organs, as well as other body parts. It is possible that he also achieved sexual gratification when cannibalizing. Chikatilo claimed that he was disgusted by the loose morals of many of his victims, who served as painful reminders of his own sexual incompetence. Moira Martingale writes in Cannibal Killers that many of the murders Chikatilo committed came after viewing sexually explicit or violent videos. Edward Gein, a farmer from Plainfield, Wisconsin, was believed to have killed at least 3 people, including his brother, a barkeeper named Mary Hogan, and the owner of the local hardware store, Bernice Warden. In 1957, police searched Gein's home and found the body of Warden along with the remains of over 15 other women. A majority of the remains found at the crime scene were robbed from a nearby cemetery. Gein was believed to have had sexual contact with the corpses. He was also an admitted transvestite who found delight in dismembering the bodies and peeling away the skin of the corpses so that he could wear them around the house. Gein was known to have cannibalized some of the bodies, including Warden's, whose heart was in a pan on the stove at the time police conducted their search of the house. Whether Gein sexualized the consumption of his victims was unclear. However, there was a strong relationship between his necrophilia and cannibalistic behavior. Intriguingly, some people who claim to be cannibals have admitted to feeling a sense of euphoria and/or intense sexual stimulation when consuming human flesh. In an article written by Clara Bruce titled "Chew on This, You're What's for Dinner," anthropophagists compared eating human flesh with having an orgasm. The experience was further believed to cause an out-of-body experience, causing effects comparable to taking mescaline. According to Leslie Hensel, author of Cannibalism as a Sexual Disorder, eating human flesh can cause an increase in levels of vitamin A and amino acids, which can cause a chemical effect on the blood and in the brain. This chemical reaction could possibly lead to the altered states that some cannibals have claimed to have experienced. However, this theory has not been substantiated by scientific evidence. In Fascination with Cannibalism Has Sexual Roots, Josh Cannon writes about psychologist Stephen Scher and his team, who conducted one of the only known studies on sex and cannibalism at Eastern Illinois University in 2002. The study surveyed several groups of people who were asked questions pertaining to cannibalism and sexual interests. The results of the study found that people were more likely to eat someone they were sexually attracted to than not. This suggests that there might be a significant sexual component in the practice of cannibalism. Most acts of cannibalism are to a degree motivated by a desire to express power or control over the victim. Cannibalism is the ultimate expression of dominance over another person. Aggression cannibalism includes acts of cannibalism that are motivated by feelings of hostility and/or fear, creating an overriding need to exert power, revenge, or control over the victim by murdering and then consuming them. Aggression cannibalism is one of the more common forms of cannibalism, and often overlaps with other types of anthropophagy, especially spiritual, ritualistic, and sexual cannibalism. Some forms of aggression cannibalism have recently gained worldwide media attention. The most recent cases include Anna Zimmerman and Ed Kemper. In 1981, Anna Zimmerman, 26, a German mother of 2, murdered her boyfriend out of anger and revenge and then dismembered his body. She froze his remains and over time defrosted portions of his body and consumed them with her unsuspecting children. She represents one of the few known cases of female criminal cannibals. Edmund Kemper was found guilty of the murders of 6 young women, his 2 grandparents, his mother, and his mother's friend. Kemper's killing spree and cannibalism were believed to be the result of his disdain for his mother and an unhappy childhood. According to Kemper, his mother psychologically abused him, and at one point forced him to sleep in the cold and dark basement when he was a child. While in the basement, his hate for his mother began to fester. In order to release the pent-up anger, he would often entertain murderous fantasies. Many of the murders Kemper committed had a large sexual component to them. He raped some of his victims, killed them, and then sexually molested the corpses. However, it is believed that the murders were primarily motivated by his feelings of anger and revenge, directly and indirectly towards his mother. In fact, Kemper claimed that the unpleasant relationship with his mother was what influenced him to act out his violent fantasies, which included cannibalism. Modern forms of spiritual and ritualistic cannibalism are very similar to that seen in tribal groups. However, the modern criminal version of this kind of cannibalism is more associated with satanic or cult group rituals, instead of tribes in remote locations of the world. In Helsinki, Finland in 1999, 2 men and a teenage girl were sent to prison for the torture, murder, and cannibalism of a 23-year-old man. The 3 individuals claimed to be Satanists, performing a ritualistic killing. In Karen Jones's Satanism and Ritual Abuse archive, she states that the murderers received a little more than 2.5 years each for the brutal slaying. Jones also mentions another case where a young girl succumbed to a similar satanic ritual. In 1999, a man named Dmitry Diomin and 2 other accomplices abducted a 15-year-old girl in Kiev. The girl was eventually murdered, and her tongue was removed and eaten by Diomin. He and the other 2 accomplices decapitated the girl and kept the skull as a trophy. Spiritual and ritualistic cannibalism is not necessarily limited to groups. Many cases of individual cannibalism incorporate spiritual and ritualistic aspects into their practice. Cannibals such as Dahmer and Kemper claimed that when they consumed their victims, they believed that they spiritually became a part of them. They also believed that their cannibalism allowed them to absorb some of their attributes, such as power. Epicurean and nutritional cannibalism refers to the consumption of human flesh, which is primarily motivated by the taste of the flesh or for its nutritional value. This form of cannibalism is believed to be rarer and is usually considered to be a sub-motivation of other forms of cannibalism, such as survival and sexual cannibalism. However, there are several cases that fall into this category that have had significant media attention. In 1981, Japanese student Issei Sagawa was arrested in France for indulging his fantasies of cannibalism. One day he propositioned a Dutch friend only to have his advances rejected. Sagawa shot and killed her and then sexually assaulted her corpse. Sagawa then carved away pieces of his victim's body, including her breasts and buttocks, and consumed them. Martingale quotes Sagawa in her book, where he exclaimed that nothing was so delicious. Sagawa was determined to be mentally incompetent to stand trial in a French court. He was held in a mental institution for a little over a year before being returned to Japan, where he was released and enjoyed a kind of celebrity status. Also in France, Nicolas Clot was convicted of the 1994 murder of 34-year-old Thierry Bissonnier. However, murder was not his only vice. Clot, who at one time worked at a children's hospital morgue in Paris, admitted to stealing flesh from the dead children and taking it home to eat. Clot claimed to have eaten the human flesh for its taste, stating that he preferred to eat it raw. He likened the taste of humans to steak tartare. Clot is also believed to be a Satanist, which could be another motivation behind his cannibalistic practices. Within the field of psychology, there is a debate on what factors lead a person to practice criminal cannibalism. There are many theories that have been presented, ranging from the over-nurturing of a child during the first few months of their life to sudden stress. However, there is little evidence to support most of these theories. Nevertheless, the theories put forth present a framework in which one is able to gain a better understanding of the possible psychological factors behind cannibalism. In an article by Sally Talwani titled, "Experts Debate What Forces Create a Cannibal," Dr. Clancy McKenzie, a psychology professor at Capital University in Washington, D.C., believes that cannibalism is a result of trauma, especially that experienced in childhood. He states that a child, following weaning from the breast, experiences separation anxiety and fantasizes about devouring the mother. A person who has experienced this may regress back to this stage in adulthood due to stress or trauma, leading the individual to seek out the fulfillment he has been denied by resorting to cannibalism. This theory is further supported by a study on cross-cultural cannibalism conducted by Eli Sagan. According to Sanday's book, Divine Hunger, Sagan argues that cannibalism is a psychological response to anger and frustration, expressed through oral aggression, and an urge to literally absorb a person through consumption. Sagan states that this urge can be directed at an enemy who may threaten the strength of the individual. Sagan believes that children who are excessively dependent on their mothers, due to maternal over-nurturing, are more likely to experience oral aggression and frustration due to separation. Moreover, he contends that the adult who subconsciously carries this oral aggression is likely to express it in an overtly dominant fashion against women by turning to cannibalism. Evidence taken during psychological interviews with cannibals supports to a degree the contention that aggression toward the mother may be one possible factor in a person's cannibalism, such as in the case of Ed Kemper. However, it is unclear whether that aggression directly leads to cannibalism. Furthermore, there is little evidence available that can confirm this theory in its entirety, and such evidence, if it existed, would be difficult to obtain. Even if there is some merit to this theory, it is unlikely that all cannibals, especially criminal cannibals, fit into this context. Conversely, in Talwani's article, Dr. Park Dietz, a criminal expert and key testifier in the Dahmer trial, stated that it is imperative that psychologists not delve too deep into the cannibals' childhood experiences to explain their practices. Dietz believes that a person can resort to cannibalism when faced with sudden traumatic stress, such as in the case of Dahmer, who murdered his first victim following a breakup of the family. Indeed, stress may be an important factor which may propel one to indulge his appetite for his own species. However, it is not the only explanation. This theory may be correct to an extent, yet it only gives a partial explanation of the motivation behind cannibalism, and it may not be applicable to all cannibals. Moreover, it does not fully explain why, in the case of Dahmer, he entertained cannibalistic fantasies in his youth. Essentially, it is important to look at the entire psychoanalytical framework surrounding the behavior, instead of only a small portion. Therefore, it may be necessary to look into one's childhood or youth, as well as their adulthood, for answers to the question of why people eat other people. There are other theories as yet unsubstantiated that suggest cannibalism to be a sexual disorder, and even an eating disorder. What seems to be a common characteristic among many cannibals is that many of them have been diagnosed with schizophrenia or some other form of personality disorder. This theory suggests that there may be an underlying neurochemical component related to cannibalistic behavior. Many cannibals, such as Andre Chikatilo, Albert Fish, Edward Gein, and Issei Sagawa, had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is defined in Reber's Dictionary of Psychology as a general label for a number of psychotic disorders with various cognitive, emotional, and behavioral manifestations, reflecting a cleavage or dissociation between functions of feeling and emotion, as well as a dissociation between thinking and cognition. Reber points to several common characteristics of schizophrenia, including thought disturbance, delusions, hallucinations, and a loss of reality. This diagnosis might help explain the experiences many cannibals claim to feel prior to, during, and after their cannibalistic activities, including blackouts, heightened sense of self and of the experience, hallucinations, and other forms of disorganized thoughts or behavior. Moreover, schizophrenia may also be a significant component in historical accounts of tribal cannibalism. The psychotic features related to schizophrenia have been found to have a significant genetic component. Thus, it can be passed from generation to generation. Therefore, it is not unlikely that schizophrenia may take root in some small indigenous tribes, which pull from a small gene pool. However, this theory is speculative and has not fully been explored. It is obvious that there is a dearth of research in the particular area of modern criminal cannibalism. Although there are many theories, few are able to fully explain why some people resort to eating human flesh. Therefore, more research is crucial in understanding the factors that lead to criminal cannibalism. The media has had a field day with Germany's first cannibalism case. Armin Maiwes, a middle-aged computer technician, has wowed the court and the public with his bizarre confessions. He appeared relaxed and normal, despite the unusual nature of his crimes. Maiwes has been charged with murder for sexual pleasure, which has a maximum sentence of 15 years. However, he claims that the man he killed in 2001, Bernd Jürgen Brandes, volunteered to be killed and eaten, so there was no murder. Here is how this unusual case began. Maywes had advertised on the internet for a well-built man who would consent to be killed and eaten. Maywes says that there are over 400 cannibal websites and chat rooms. Supposedly, more than 200 men responded favorably to his ad. Brandes was one of them, and they got together for dinner at Brandes's home in Rottenburg. It's hard to say whether Brandes had planned to serve his penis that night, or whether it came up as an idea once the two men were together. Maywes claimed that Brandes wanted to have Maywes cut off his penis. Maywes then cooked the penis, and they ate it together. At some point, Maywes stabbed Brandes and dissected him, putting parts of his body in the freezer for future consumption. These events, at least in Maywes's mind, had enough entertainment value to record on his camcorder for future viewing. Perhaps this hobby could have continued had a student not seen another of Maywes's advertisements on the internet and alerted the police. Bernd came to me of his own free will to end his life, Maywes told the court in his trial, which began December 3, 2003. For him, it was a nice death. Before his death, Brandes consumed a large quantity of liquor and 20 or more sleeping pills. Cannibalism may not be against the law in Germany, but it guarantees one a free mental examination. What the court found out after Maywes's psychiatric exam was very interesting. He claimed that watching horror films is what initiated the fantasies that he had as a child about eating people. Initially, he wanted to eat his schoolmates, he told the court. The defense has been arguing that there was no murder because Brandes volunteered to be killed. The prosecution, however, feels that Maywes's hobbies are very dangerous and that he should be locked up permanently. CNN reported that the court in Kassel ruled that Maywes had no base motives in the crime, sparing him a murder conviction. He was sentenced to 8.5 years in jail. Eventually, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment in a retrial in May 2006. An argument over a porn tape, a scuffle, a possibly unintentional murder, all topped off with a multi-course 2-day meal. That's how Robert Ackerman became Vienna's teenage cannibal killer. His case doesn't fit the typical profile of cannibalism. Ackerman's motives were neither ritualistic, particularly bloodthirsty, nor, despite the pleasure the crime provided him, apparently sexual in nature. His motive, evidently, was among the most dangerous of all: twisted, misdirected, morbid curiosity. The handsome, blonde young man seems to have killed Joseph Schweiger impulsively, or even accidentally, then seized on the opportunity to explore his frightening fascination with the hidden secrets of the human body. By August of 2007, Ackerman, then 19, had left his native Cologne, Germany, for Vienna, Austria, where he was staying in short-term housing for the mentally ill and homeless run by a private charity. He shared a room with Josef Schweiger, 49, who had been in the facility since that June. Weekly social workers don't seem to have been alarmed by Ackerman's behavior or concerned about the pair's feuds. But neighbors on the family-filled tenement block who argued with the increasingly disturbed Ackerman saw him crawling naked through the yard howling at the moon or dumping what appeared to be blood from his window, realized the teen was dangerous. Ackerman was once a seemingly normal, friendly, intelligent boy. In early adolescence with psychological problems instigated either by the physiological changes of puberty or perhaps his father's abandonment of the family, he changed drastically. Ackerman began hearing voices and manifesting serious behavioral problems. At 15, he left home. He experimented with methamphetamines, ecstasy, and harder drugs, and with crime. He stole, sometimes pretending to be a businessman in order to bamboozle banks. He even masqueraded as a doctor for darker purposes. Ackerman's history of severe mental illness was marked by several hospital stays, and he was diagnosed with schizoaffective psychosis. German authorities declared him too ill for prison, but not quite sick enough to be placed in a state hospital for his protection or for that of society. Ackerman was on his own, despite his mother's desperate pleas and evidence that his disease could be controlled with medication, which he tended not to take if left unsupervised. He ended up in Vienna, where earlier in 2007 he was arrested at a local hospital. He had been impersonating a doctor, hoping that, disguised as a member of the hospital staff, he might be able to sneak into an operating room and take part in surgery. A boyhood dream. He would soon get his chance. The night of August 26, 2007, the roommates quarreled for what was hardly the first time. The high-strung Ackerman had discovered he was missing a pornographic videocassette and a cigarette lighter. He confronted his roommate. Joseph Schweiger denied everything, but he did have the tape. Furious, Ackerman rifled through the older man's pockets to see what else he might have pilfered, and a vicious fight broke out. In Ackerman's version of the story, the two exchanged blows until he hit Schweiger with such force that the older man fell on the bed, knocked out. Police say Ackerman, in fact, bludgeoned Schweiger with a 22-pound dumbbell, cracking his skull. Ackerman says that he didn't realize there was anything seriously wrong, so he left Schweiger on the bed, went back to his own room, cooked and ate his non-human dinner, read a few chapters of a book, and drifted peacefully and innocently to sleep. Schweiger didn't get up the next day. Ackerman claims he assumed the man was sleeping off a hangover, a frequent occurrence. That night, he checked in on him and saw him sprawled in the same position in which he'd left him. Ackerman, ever the aspiring physician, checked for a pulse and heartbeat. Schweiger was dead. Ackerman reacted to this discovery not with remorse or panic, but with eager delight. Finally, he could satisfy his curiosity about the inner workings of the human body. In an interview later, Ackerman would describe this as his greatest wish, to see what we look like inside. He has stressed that he knew this would not hurt Schweiger, and would provide him with his own deepest joy. Ackerman used a razor-sharp butterfly knife to slice Schweiger from groin to throat, opening his abdomen and cutting away the top of his skull. He reached into the corpse's abdomen to explore the wet mysteries of the body and to feel Schweiger's internal organs. With a butcher knife, he cut out his intestines. Then he removed his brain and placed it on a plate. Ackerman would later try to claim that he did not eat Schweiger, and that he merely tasted some of his blood to see what it was like. A scientific experiment, if you will. On August 28th, the second day after the fight, he called the homeless hostel's cleaning woman into the apartment and showed her the body. He suggested she call the police. When the police arrived at the blood-soaked first-floor apartment, a dispassionate Ackerman told them to look at what had happened, as if it were an inexplicable random event in which he'd had no part. He even initially tried to blame the grisly scene on the apartment's mice. Evidence quickly exonerated the rodent population and implicated the troubled teen. Police on the scene reported that Ackerman was drooling and disoriented. His mouth was smeared with blood and viscera and his clothes damp with the mess. He'd already eaten some of Schweiger's brain, internal organs, and bicep tissue. The victim's tongue and the rest of his brain were plated for the boy's perverse breakfast. Even as deranged and ecstatic as he was at the time, the boy quickly realized he was caught. He confessed. Unsurprisingly, DNA tests later showed that the blood that drenched the teen's lips and hands did indeed belong to the corpse. Authorities say that Robert Ackerman has since been a model patient and prisoner. Whether the attack was a severe psychotic episode or an outpouring of the young man's long-standing sadistic urges is unclear. But therapy and consistent monitored medication have seemingly returned him to the real world, and he's able to talk about his crime. On September 4, 2008, an Austrian jury agreed that Ackerman was not fit to stand trial, but would spend the rest of his life in Austria's Göllersdorf, a high-security mental hospital. The cannibal of Vienna now says he plans to use his time institutionalized to study medicine so that if he's ever released, he can fulfill his lifelong ambition to become a surgeon. And instead of our usual outro, I know you like that outro. I'm sorry. I'd like to give a shout out to a friend of the channel, Deadbug. It's a true crime channel with similar stories, but a different approach. A more direct approach, if you will. And because of that, he's pretty much shadow banned by the YouTube algorithm. So I thought I'd show him some love and tell you guys about the channel. He helped us in the past, unconditionally, so this is more like a thank you than a helping hand. Thanks, Chris. Keep up the good work.